Okay, so today I'd like to talk about, excuse me, today I'd like to talk about a controversial subject, which is the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. If you're not familiar with this, it's a student-led campaign at Oxford University, Oriel College, which has its origins actually, I believe, last year in South Africa. And it revolves around a man called Cecil Rhodes. If you don't know, he was a famous 19th century British colonialist, industrialist, mine magnate who, in some ways, symbolized the British Empire in Africa more than anyone else. Um, he was a very, very important historical figure and a very controversial historical figure. Still is very much so in the UK as well. Um, Rhodes is symbolized by a famous historical picture, which is called the Rhodes Colossus. It shows him with one foot in Cairo, one foot in Cape Town, and it's sort of symbolic of what he wanted to do in terms of expanding the railway system from North Africa to South Africa. This was, of course, a time of the scramble for Africa when European powers were vying over which part of Africa they would control. In the end, the British turned out to be the largest empire. That goes without saying. In this video, I won't have time to talk about everything that I want to talk about, but I want to touch on some of the main issues at least. Um, And as I say with all my contentious videos, all I ask is that people hear me out to the end before passing judgment. Because sometimes with something like this, people rush to judgment without actually listening to everything. That's all I ask, and then say what you want. Um, so basically, this campaign argues that Rhodes was a racist. He was symbolic of white privilege, and having his statue at Oriel College today is an anachronism. His statues were already removed in South Africa. Um, this has divided opinion quite sharply. The student side, of course, and those campaigning for it to have it removed are very vocal in terms of, oh, he must go. He's basically a racist, he must go. Now, critics have said that what they're doing essentially is airbrushing history. I've read a compelling article in Spiked by Brendan O'Neill, who says that rather than Rhodes falling, what must fall is the cult of the victim. And he made a very compelling case against the statue falling. Um, I I've given some thought to this, and I sort of see both sides, but I do think there is a lot of hypocrisy in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. Now, this is not because I'm a big fan of Cecil Rhodes or I'm a defender of him. I mean, if Cecil Rhodes were around today, I'd probably be writing to Amnesty International about the conditions in his mines. I'm sure in many ways he was an unpleasant man, but he was also a great man with an incredible vision and who had a profound impact on the hegemony of this country in the 19th century. That's something that, as a nation, I think we cannot overlook. Um, I think a lot of the Pan Africanist mindset, and this is something I've touched on before, is based on blaming colonialism for everything and refusing to acknowledge any responsibility for the post independence actions of certain African governments. I think that's hypocritical. Now, the leader of this campaign, Nkosi Kwabe, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that name, is a 24-year-old South African student. He's now went on to say that Oxford University is responsible for all the suffering around the world, and he's attacked France as well. I think the guy's a hypocrite. If he really had conviction, why did he choose to take a Rhodes Scholarship in the first place? That's crazy. If he really has such a victimhood mentality, if he really has conviction about what he believes in, then why take a scholarship in the name of the very person that you're denouncing? It's total hypocrisy. It would be a bit like me, as a critic of communism, taking I know not one exists, but taking a Mao Zedong scholarship whilst denouncing the man as a brutal tyrant. It would be hypocrisy. Also, the victimhood mentality that he has. This guy's actually had the audacity to compare himself to Nelson Mandela. Now, one of the first things that Mandela done when he was released from prison was controversially among the ANC wear the kit of the Springboks, the South African rugby team, if you've seen the film Invictus, which was associated with apartheid. Mandela done that because he wanted to unify the country. Mandela, in my opinion, was a great leader precisely because he united his country, which is a lot more than could be said for some of the leaders that have taken over in the post-independence years, the likes of Robert Mugabe, Emperor Picasso, so-called. There's numerous other examples. I am sick and tired of hypocrisy. I am sick and tired of people denouncing the British Empire whilst completely turning a blind eye to far more recent injustices by the likes of Idi Amin, Robert Mugabe, and so on. In fact, in the case of Mugabe, it's ongoing. And I really think if this guy really wants to be an asset to his country, he should complete his studies, go back, stand for Parliament, and actually do something about the problems that South Africa is facing today. Now, there's no way you could blame HIV on the British Empire. There's no way you can blame the crime epidemic on the British Empire. That doesn't mean that some of the problems that South Africa or other African countries face can't be blamed on colonialism. I'm open minded enough to absolutely recognise that we do have responsibility. I mean, in the case of, and by we, I'm talking about European colonialists generally, in the case of Rwanda, for example, the Belgians were partly responsible for causing mistrust between the Tutsis and Hutus with the thesis of so called Tutsi domination. Um, but I just cannot stand the hypocrisy of people who think that the way to solve today's problems is by demonizing the old empire. It's a very, in my view, it's a very narrow way of thinking. And it's a cop out, basically. Because what it does is say, basically, African governments today have no responsibility whatsoever. We'll just blame it all on the empires. Now, people will no doubt say, well, you're an apologist. You're a white guy, you're an apologist. I don't think I am. Because if I was an apologist, I would be going out of my way to present Rhodes as a great man. I'd be saying that none of the allegations against him are true. There has been counter arguments, for example, that his racist attitudes. He also had a condescending attitude toward fellow Oxford fellows. Why Oxford fellows? I don't know about that. Look, I've no doubt that in many ways someone like Cecil Rhodes may have been a pretty unpleasant man, but that doesn't take away the fact that he was a towering figure. For good or bad, he had a massive influence. Massive. And I also take the view that something like the British Empire is too big to simply dismiss as entirely bad or entirely good. Now, I'm equally critical of this jingoistic sort of mentality of, oh, rule Britannia, we were always right. The F-wing traitors need to shut up and all this stuff. I don't share that mentality. I absolutely acknowledge some of the terrible things that were done in our name. I totally get that. But I don't believe that as a nation we should constantly go around apologising, hiding our head in shame. This country gave a lot of positive things to the world. There's a Westminster system for a start. Infrastructure, industry, railways. Sure, a lot of that was built on exploitation. I get that. But the principle itself of expanding these ideas was not a bad thing. I mean, I just think it is a cop out to constantly blame empire or use empire as an excuse for absolutely everything. And it's something a lot of leaders do when their opinion polls are dipping or when they are facing serious problems of their own. And it's a complete cop out. I'm only waiting to see how long it will be before Pierre Nkurunziza in Burundi blames the French for the problems his country is facing, even though he is the one stubbornly choosing to cling on to power. And the thing is, I don't accept this logic that every single one of 1 billion plus Africans has this Pan Africanist mindset. I think there's many Africans who do recognize that there are problems that Africans themselves need to deal with. They shouldn't always be blamed on outsiders. And I really get tired of this, to be honest. Now, in terms of how we remember someone like Cecil Rhodes, there's many controversial figures in history as actually an interesting defender, or not defender, but critic of the campaign was F.W. de Klerk, former South African president. Now, de Klerk would have every reason to hate someone like Cecil Rhodes. Why? Because de Klerk's ancestors were Boers, and what we'd done to the Boers was awful. The British kept Boers in concentration camps. Thousands of civilians died. It was a crime against humanity. His ancestors suffered from that. So you would think that F.W. de Klerk would be in support of the campaign. He says it's ridiculous. If we're going to airbrush history, then you'll find that half the statues in Britain would be gone. This is a country, incidentally, that has statues of Gandhi and Mandela. In other words, far from being jingoistic and always shouting about how great we are, we actually provide statues for the very people who fought against us. Now, surely that says something about the British character. I'm sick and tired of people running down my country. I'm sick and tired of people demonizing my country, and I will defend my country. I have responsibility to be honest about our past, and I've always argued that's the way for any country to go forward. But at the same time, I don't agree that it was entirely negative. The empire was built on selfish grounds. It was based on exploitation, and without doubt, there was racism in there as well. And there was things that we can never ever condone. But I refuse to accept the politically correct version of history that's pretty much it was evil and that is it. You cannot demonize the British Empire without looking at the things that spread around the world as a result of the British Empire. That's the reality. Brendan O'Neill in his article makes the point that as someone of Irish descent, he would then, should he be offended every time he sees a depiction of a potato because it would remind him of the suffering his ancestors went through in the Great Famine? This is not sarcastic. This is actually what we're looking at. It's a year zero mentality by this very purist school of thought, particularly on the left, that is, as he put it, soft and tyrannical at the same time, i.e., basically rewriting history to suit themselves. Um, we'll have to round this up soon, but for those reasons, I'm not so sure that removing the statue is going to mean anything. I do believe that there should be a balanced view taught of Rhodes, so certainly all of his negative side should be taught and spoken about. This is not China. We shouldn't censor our history. But at the same time, Rhodes was an incredible man. He accomplished huge things. Did he do it with cynical reasons? Perhaps. But to just demonize him without looking at his complex character, I think is very lazy, quite frankly. That applies to the British Empire in general. I don't consider myself a neo-colonialist. Okay, the empire, among other things, caused us financial ruin. I don't believe in bringing back the empire or something like that. I believe in teaching the negative side of it, but I don't believe in this lazy worldview that A, the empire was entirely bad, and B, oh well, you could just sort of dismiss all the problems of today on empire. I think that's lazy. I think it's a cop out. In some cases, African states have been independent for up to 6 decades. How long is it going to? How long is the empire or empires going to be an excuse for modern leaders not to deal sufficiently with the problems in their own country? And another point: the United Kingdom is one of the most generous countries in the world when it comes to overseas aid. If someone like this student leader, frankly, is privileged. Oxford is a world class institution. The vast majority of his fellow South Africans will not get this opportunity. What's he doing? He's choosing to bite the hand that feeds him. I don't have much respect for the hypocrisy this guy blatantly has. If he really cares about injustice and human rights, why is he not speaking out against Mugabe? The guy's a hypocrite. And as for the movement, I think that they basically represent the arrogant new left. our view is correct, we're going to silence everyone else. That's pretty much it. So by all means, the complex character of Rhodes must be discussed. By all means, criticise him, but let's not censor history.